If you look at the coast of Southern California, you'll find some of the most insanely expensive real estate on Earth. Tens of millions of people are packed tightly against the Pacific Ocean right here. But look, just 20 miles offshore, and you'll see an 8-island archipelago with perfect Mediterranean weather and hardly any people. So how did a pristine island chain sitting right next to America's most crowded coastline manage to stay almost completely empty? To understand why the Channel Islands remain so hauntingly empty today, we first have to understand where they are, and more importantly, what they are. Because despite being near each other, these islands are remarkably different, and even have different origins. In many ways, this single chain should really have two different names, but we'll get to that. The Channel Islands are an 8-island archipelago stretching roughly 160 miles along the coast of Southern California from the Santa Barbara Channel in the north down to just off the coast of San Diego in the south. They sit within what geographers call the Southern California Bight, a massive inward-sweeping curve of the North American coastline, where ocean currents do some very strange things. While the rest of the California coast is battered by freezing southward-flowing waters from Alaska, the Bight creates a massive oceanic eddy. It catches warm equatorial waters moving north and swirls them together with cold Arctic currents. This creates a highly unique localized marine climate, wrapping the islands in thick marine layers and unpredictable weather. But that swirling ocean current is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how strange this place really is. You see, the 8 islands are divided cleanly into two distinct groups: the Northern Channel Islands and the Southern Channel Islands. Geographically speaking, they could not be more different. The Northern group consists of San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa. If you stand on the beaches of Santa Barbara on a clear day, you can actually see these islands rising out of the ocean like a massive jagged wall on the horizon. They follow an almost perfect east-to-west line. Santa Cruz is the titan of the group and the largest of all 8 islands. It's so big, in fact, that it has its own massive central valley complete with a fault line running right down the middle, flanked by 2 rugged, imposing mountain ranges. You can see them in person with me because I spent a few days there earlier this year. Then there's Anacapa, which isn't so much a traditional island as a series of sheer, terrifying volcanic cliffs jutting violently out of the ocean, completely devoid of fresh water. At the far western edge sits San Miguel, taking the absolute brunt of the Pacific Ocean's fury, battered by relentless gale-force winds and shrouded in thick, heavy marine fog for most of the year. So how did these northern islands even get here? You might look at a map and assume they just broke off from the mainland, maybe due to rising sea levels or a massive ancient earthquake. But the truth is far more violent, and it hints at why building a civilization here would be so incredibly difficult. Millions of years ago, the tectonic plate under the Pacific Ocean smashed into the North American plate. The colossal friction didn't just push the land up, it actually caught a massive block of the Earth's crust and spun it. As the Pacific plate ground its way northwest, it rotated this block of crust a full 90 degrees, tearing it away from the mainland and sinking parts of it beneath the sea. The Northern Channel Islands are literally the tops of those submerged mountains, the highest peaks of a sunken transverse range. But while the Northern Islands were born from a spinning block of crust, the Southern Islands have an even stranger origin story. The Southern Channel Islands San Nicolas, Santa Barbara, Santa Catalina, and San Clemente are much more scattered. Instead of a neat little line, they're flung far out into the open ocean, separated by deep, plunging underwater canyons. Some of these islands are incredibly isolated. San Nicolas, for example, sits more than 60 miles offshore. Unlike the northern group, these southern islands are primarily the result of intense volcanic activity and slow, grinding tectonic uplift. They weren't broken off from the continent, many of them were pushed straight out of the ocean floor. San Clemente, the southernmost island, is essentially a giant tilted block of earth rising slowly out of the sea over millions of years. Catalina, which you'll hear more about in a minute, is the most mountainous and rugged of the southern group, featuring incredibly steep canyons and a surprisingly warm Mediterranean climate. Because of this violent tectonic geography, the Channel Islands developed into something completely unique on the North American continent, and they're often referred to as the Galapagos of North America. Since these islands were never connected to the mainland, not even when sea levels were at their absolute lowest during the last ice age, any plant or animal that made it out there was entirely cut off from the rest of the world, evolving in complete, utter isolation. Take the island fox, a descendant of the mainland grey fox that shrank down to the size of a house cat just to survive on the limited resources of the islands. But the physical isolation that created this biological wonderland is only half the story. The sheer cliffs, the lack of fresh water, and the perilous ocean currents made the Channel Islands an absolute fortress. They were incredibly difficult to reach and even harder to survive on, and yet humans did reach them. In fact, they reached them far earlier than almost anywhere else in the Americas. So how did ancient peoples conquer a sheer volcanic archipelago with no fresh water? That brings us to a human history that defies everything we thought we knew about early migration and sets the stage for the bizarre real estate battles to come. Just like navigating the isolation of the Channel Islands required ancient peoples to figure out hidden patterns of the ocean, trying to get people to find your website online can be just as isolating without a map. If you run a website, a blog, a channel, or a side project, the number one question is always, how do you actually get people to discover you on Google? To solve that, today's sponsor, Ahrefs Free, offers a set of no-cost tools that completely map out the internet's geography. When archaeologists were excavating a site in a steep canyon on Santa Rosa Island in 1959, they unearthed something that completely rewrote California's history books. They found the remains of what we now call the Arlington Springs Man. Dating back roughly 13,000 years, these are some of the oldest human remains ever discovered anywhere in North America. This discovery proved that the very first humans to populate the Americas didn't just walk across a land bridge and hike south, they had boats, and they were navigating the treacherous waters of the Pacific coast. For thousands of years, two distinct indigenous groups called these islands home. In the rugged, windswept northern Channel Islands lived the Chumash, while the warmer, more southern islands were inhabited by the Tongva. But how did these early Americans actually survive, let alone thrive on isolated islands with almost no reliable fresh water and terrible farming conditions? The answer lies in the ocean. The Chumash and the Tongva didn't look inward to the land, they looked outward to the sea. They were master seafarers who engineered incredibly advanced plank canoes called tommels. Using redwood trunks that drifted down the coast from Northern California, they glued the planks together using naturally occurring asphalt that seeped up from the ocean floor. These impressive vessels allowed them to hunt massive marine mammals, fish the deep kelp forests, and establish a massive, highly lucrative trade network with the mainland. For over 10 millennia, the Channel Islands were home to a booming, complex, and wealthy maritime society. But this thriving island civilization was about to be completely erased by an arrival from across the globe. In 1542, Spanish explorer Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed into the Southern California Bight, becoming the first European to make contact with the islanders. For the next 2 centuries, contact was sporadic, but the introduction of European diseases began to quietly decimate the indigenous population. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, the Spanish had established their mission system along the California coast. Facing starvation, ecological collapse from foreign species, and immense pressure from Spanish missionaries, the remaining Chumash and Tongva were systematically relocated to the mainland missions. By the 1830s, the Channel Islands were entirely emptied of their original inhabitants. But the islands wouldn't stay empty for long. They were about to be overrun not by people, but by tens of thousands of hungry animals. Following Mexico's independence from Spain, the islands were carved up into massive private land grants. A new wave of early California migrants and European settlers looked at the treeless, grassy slopes of the Channel Islands and saw the perfect environment for livestock. They brought over enormous herds of sheep, cattle, and pigs. For decades, the islands functioned as massive floating ranches, but without any natural predators to keep them in check, the livestock bred out of control. They overgraze the delicate island vegetation, stripping the landscapes bare and causing catastrophic soil erosion. The Galapagos of North America was rapidly being turned into a barren, dusty wasteland. But while most of the archipelago was being used as isolated, windswept pastures, one specific island was about to take a drastically different and much more glamorous path. That island was Santa Catalina. Geographically, Catalina had a massive advantage over the others. It was relatively close to the mainland. But more importantly, it featured a naturally protected deep-water cove on its leeward side, shielding it from the punishing Pacific swells. Throughout the 1800s, this perfect little harbour became a notorious haven for smugglers, sea otter poachers, and pirates who wanted to hide just out of reach of the authorities in Los Angeles. It even briefly hosted a minor gold rush. But everything changed in 1919 when a man named William Wrigley Jr., the incredibly wealthy chewing gum magnate from Chicago, bought a controlling interest in the island. Wrigley looked at Catalina and didn't see a sheep ranch or a smuggler's den. He saw a Mediterranean paradise. Wrigley poured millions of his own dollars into developing the town of Avalon around that perfect protected cove. He built infrastructure, planted exotic gardens, and constructed the iconic, massive circular casino building that still dominates the harbor today. To draw crowds, he even brought his baseball team, the Chicago Cubs, to the island for spring training. Hollywood stars and wealthy socialites soon followed, taking the short steamship ride from Los Angeles to escape the mainland and drink under the California sun. Avalon boomed, eventually becoming the only incorporated city on any of the Channel Islands, boasting a permanent population of just over 4,000 people today. Catalina Island proved definitively that you could build a luxury paradise just off the coast of Southern California. It had perfect weather, spectacular views, and the massive consumer market of Los Angeles right next door. So if Wrigley could do it with Catalina, why didn't real estate developers do exactly the same thing to the other 7 islands? And more importantly, why did Catalina never grow beyond its small population? The answer involves explosive military testing, bitter legal battles, and a massive 11th-hour intervention by the United States government. With William Wrigley Jr. proving that a lucrative Mediterranean-style resort could thrive on Catalina Island, it seemed inevitable that the rest of the archipelago would eventually fall to the relentless sprawl of Southern California real estate. Los Angeles was exploding in population, and developers were constantly hungry for the next big land grab. So why didn't they capitalize on these islands? Why aren't Santa Cruz or Santa Rosa covered in luxury condos and oceanfront infinity pools like many Mediterranean islands today? The first massive roadblock to island development didn't come from environmentalists, it came from the United States military. As the rumblings of World War II began to echo across the Pacific, the United States realized it had a massive, unprotected coastline. The Channel Islands were suddenly viewed not as potential real estate, but as crucial strategic outposts and training grounds. So the federal government outright seized San Nicolas and San Clemente Islands. They evicted the sheep ranchers, installed radar stations, and began using the isolated landmasses for intense naval gunnery practice and explosive testing. Today, both islands remain strictly under the control of the U.S. Navy. San Clemente is the Navy's only remaining ship-to-shore bombardment range, and parts of both islands are littered with unexploded ordnance, which definitively took 2 of the largest southern islands completely off the commercial market. But what about the massive northern islands? They were sitting right there, just off the coast of Santa Barbara and Ventura, seemingly ripe for the taking. The barrier here was a toxic mix of hostile geography and fiercely guarded private monopolies. For over a century, islands like Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa were tightly held by just a handful of incredibly wealthy ranching families, like the Stantons and the Vales. They operated the islands as their own personal fiefdoms, running highly profitable sheep and cattle operations. For a long time, they had zero interest in selling to city developers. But even if they had wanted to sell, early developers faced an engineering nightmare. Unlike Catalina, which was blessed with a perfect deep-water natural harbour at Avalon, the northern islands were much more difficult to access. Their coastlines were defined by sheer cliffs, pounding surf, and treacherous winds. Worse yet, they lacked reliable, large-scale freshwater sources needed to sustain a sprawling luxury population. Pumping water from the mainland via undersea pipes or building massive desalination plants was simply too expensive. For decades, the math just didn't make sense. However, as the 1960s and 1970s rolled around, the math started to change. The Southern California mainland was filling up rapidly, and coastal real estate prices were skyrocketing. Suddenly, the exorbitant cost of building island infrastructure didn't seem so crazy anymore. Developers began circling the northern islands, drafting serious proposals for massive subdivisions, luxury resorts, and private airports. The big city population was finally coming for the Channel Islands. But just as the bulldozers were getting ready to mobilize, a massive 11th-hour intervention stopped them in their tracks. The environmental movement of the 1970s had completely shifted public opinion in California. Scientists and conservationists realized that if these islands were developed, their unique, highly specialized ecosystems, the Galapagos of North America, would be destroyed forever. In a frantic race against the real estate market, the National Park Service and non-profit groups like the Nature Conservancy launched an aggressive campaign to buy the islands back. It was a bitter, exhausting legal battle, but the conservationists won. In 1980, Congress officially established Channel Islands National Park, eventually absorbing San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, Anacapa, and Santa Barbara Islands. The government and conservation groups bought out the remaining ranches, removed tens of thousands of destructive sheep and pigs, and allowed the islands to return to their wild, prehistoric state. So, military occupation and aggressive environmental protection saved 7 of the islands. But that leaves us with one glaring question. What about Catalina? It already had the harbour, the fame, and the Wrigley fortune. Why did Avalon stall out at a population of roughly 4,000 people? Why didn't it become a booming high-rise metropolis like Honolulu or Ibiza? The answer comes down to severe physical limitations and a shocking plot twist from the Wrigley family themselves. First, Avalon is fundamentally boxed in by its own topography. The town sits in a narrow canyon, surrounded by impossibly steep mountains. There's simply nowhere left to build. More importantly, Catalina suffers from a terrifying lack of fresh water. The island is entirely dependent on a small reservoir and a heavily taxed desalination plant. During severe California droughts, Avalon residents face incredibly strict water rationing. The island literally can't sustain a larger human population. But the final nail in the coffin for Catalina's real estate empire came in 1972. Instead of selling off the rest of the island's rugged interior to developers, the Wrigley family did the exact opposite. They established the Catalina Island Conservancy and deeded a staggering 88% of the entire island to the non-profit. They legally locked the land away, ensuring it could never be developed. And that's how the most valuable coastline in America stayed empty. Through a bizarre cocktail of military seizures, hostile geography, crippling water shortages, and a frantic race for conservation, the Channel Islands survived so they can be enjoyed by everyone, not just the wealthy elite. Today, they stand as a silent, rugged monument to what California looked like long before the major urban areas took over.